I read an article that you did on monogamy, polyamory, and beyond. So this was on my radar before this book came out, Love and Freedom. So your most recent publication, Transcending Monogamy and Polyamory, and then you developed a term, novogamy. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and some things about that? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'll just say quickly like that at most of my books, there's, at most of the books, I would say, of most people I know in the humanities and transpersonal stuff, is rooted biographically. So I'm not going into details, but in my own adult life, I experienced periods of being poly, like especially in Bay Area and California for a decade. And then I went into a period of romantic asexual celibacy for 3 years. And then I was called to explore monogamy again. Anyway, at some point I realized, I can be monogamous or polyamorous without serious fears of conflicts. And it depends on the cards that life threw at me, and also the developmental factors, pools, mine and the people I'm relating to, and many other things. So I start feeling myself, I wouldn't identify myself with being mono or poly. And then also at the same time, I would witness what I call the monopoly wars, like this kind of predicament of mutual condescending and judgment between mono people and poly people. We're talking a bit before, and I realized, like this is very ideological. I did the research, of course, and those judgments, they don't hold. They are not evidence-based. So it's very ideological in that way. And then, and at some point I realized, I started coming across more and more people that they were feeling increasingly oppressed by these questions. Are you monogamous or polyamorous? Because in this white and black world that we live, you are either or. And it's even worse if you have been poly once, if you deviated from monocentrism, the scarlet letter, the stigma stays with you forever. Even after 10 years living monogamous relationship, some close friends, they would describe me, oh, Jorge's polyamorous. You see, so that's where it came from. So I started mapping out a variety of ways in which people can really deconstruct and live intimate relationship beyond the binary, in the same way that the transgender movement did with gender. Consider that even 10, 15 years ago, for most people, there were no option, male or female. Now transgender individuals and the movement thought that there are so many ways to be in between, beyond, both, So the same with monopoly, like I can just have a few examples. I already mentioned developmentally at different moments of my life, I can be monogamous or polyamorous. And there's not a universal sequence. Some people start mono and poly, vice versa, some things spiral and so forth, But also for some couples, like they're monogamous at home, but then they go to Burning Man Festival or certain places, and then they are poly. Are they mono or poly? Depends on where they are, And also, I always bring this example of our inner diversity. We were talking, you and I, before, when this citation of Walt Whitman, right? You say I contradict myself. Yes, I do. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And it's true. For many people, they believe in monogamy. They think it's the way to go in their hearts also. But sexually, they want sexual diversity. They're very poly. But also the other way around, I know a poly activist, someone who researches and writes books on polyamory. And she told me and she has written this in her books. It's I believe in polyamory. I think it's emancipatory for women. I think it's really, really good. But when I mate sexually, I just cannot be with one man, So it's a tremendous variety, or transcending into a new identity, like the transgender, and that's where novogamy comes in, a different term, and could be another term or no term at all. But you transcend that into a different existential identity that is kind of like a hybrid or even beyond that kind of mental categories, As you know from the book, there are many, many other examples. I'll just give you one fun for the transpersonal audience, and that's the one of the subtle path, in which people can relate also to subtle entities, More and more people with ayahuasca. It's also many traditional shamans. They used to be married with entities, spirit marriage. This great book just came out by Megan Rose, a student of CIS. I was working with her in her dissertation, spirit marriage, but also, avatars in virtual reality. Some people are very monogamous here in this natural social world, And in that world, they are super poly, and they encounter a lot of women, romantic walks, and erotic conversation, and the last example I'll just give is like in terms of the subtle path, this professor, a friend of mine at CIS, was an expert in dreams, and he was a lucid dreamer. And his new wife, was a lucid dreamer as well, So they both have had sexual encounters in the dream world intentionally in the past. So they had to discuss, does our monogamous vow extend to the dream world? And one of them say yes, the other say, they had to attend couple therapy. So you see, the world today is like really complex, and the monopoly binary doesn't capture, the question,
These relationship dynamics, it's always popular interest because relationships are some of the hardest. This is maybe the hardest thing in the world is relationships.
Right.
Like the most difficult, challenging thing. All of your stuff, all of your shadows are brought up in relationships and vice versa. And so
Right.
it's some of the most challenging work. And so this has been really popular recently. There are people that have kind of spoken in ways that have been judged as patriarchal, thinking of it as very masculine centric. But what are some of the challenges or limitations of the conventional relationship dynamics? What are some of the ways that this gets in people's way?
What I would call post-patriarchal couples, men and women who are together and they have gone through their feminist inside revolution, they have gone through the awakening of like trying to do things differently. They still we need to be very compassionate with ourselves and others, in the sense that we carry millennia, probably hundreds of thousands of years of patriarchal relationships, co-created also by women and men. I'm not victimizing women. I think there were some ways in which those relationships probably were serving an evolutionary purpose in certain moments in life, but now, of course, they don't, So that's a challenge. It's like the dragon that never sleeps. We need to be very aware always, when that little joke that we make, that it's like patriarchal, and of course, also we need to be a bit relaxed, because also it can go the other way around and become like this fascism, like this, like people like someone makes like the minimal, like something that could sound as patriarchal, and then gets crucified, and it's another extreme. It's very sad, because today, like for example, many men who go through this kind of revolution, like they become sometimes feminized, they can spiritualize but more feminine, and they lose their balls, so to speak. I remember with a friend of mine in California, when we realized the art in the spiritual culture, especially Buddhist culture, very equanimous, but there was like a lack of energy. When I arrived to CIS as a student in 1993, some of the girls there were saying like, we're glad you're here. You come from Spain, because all the men here, they have no initiative. They never hit on us. I mean, they're great. They're very sensitive, but they're boring. We just want guys who, and of course, the key is like how to integrate, how to go through that revolution, how to really don't be patriarchal, cultivate different kinds of relationships without losing your balls in the sense, in the case of men, we had this idea, would write a book called Buddhism with Balls. We didn't do it at the end. We didn't want to be disrespectful, of course, but there was something to it in a fun way, I think I don't know if I went to different directions that you asked, but I could look more and more about this,
That resonates. Like kind of even going back a little bit to what you were speaking about before, of transcending identity, transcending these identifiers. Like you don't even need, you don't. It sounded to me like you were saying you don't even need the identity of novogamy necessarily, but it's about, but that's just a helpful. That's a helpful concept to package what is being spoken about and what is being communicated. And so I resonate with this moving beyond, as transpersonal as we are in this field. This transpersonal is to move beyond that personal, that ego, the personas, the many masks that we put on. And it seems that in a lot of the ways that the traditional relationship functions is that people get into monogamous relationships and have to pick up masks that they have never worn before.
All right.
and they put on these masks that they have never worn before, and now they are losing aspects of themselves. That I had spoken to a colleague that say for 20 years of your life you are single and you are figuring out your relationships and who you're attracted to and all of these things and what attracts you in general. But then you get into this relationship and you have to let go of all of that interest. All of your interest in anything else. Now it has to be that one person. And if not, you're in the doghouse. And if not, then you've now ashamed them and yourself, and you're no good. You're a bad human for all of this, and it just explodes on you.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's very tragic, because in a way, by doing that, we're kind of like we're like putting big obstacles for the emergence and wider presence of embodied love in life, in the world. And I think that's one of the steps towards like making this world a more embodied heaven, it's very interesting, like if you realize, like, in order to be touched in this culture, right? Either you have a lover or you have to pay for massage. What the fuck? Really, if you look at it, it's like really crazy, right? Of course, you hug, I'm very physical, I have a lot of physical connection. And, people like us, we develop like cuddling friends. We're creating this culture, we're expanding this culture, But mainstream culture, that's the alternative, You are married, you have a lover, or you pay for massage. And that's horrible, because we need that nurturance. I think that no wonder so many billions of people are kind of hooked up with pornography and the internet. The statistics are mind-blowing. I give talks on this, on the shadow of sexuality, and the statistics of Pornhub and things like that are mind-blowing, right? And I think it speaks to that, the lack of nurturance of eroticism. You have exiled eros from everyday life, and also physical contact is very important, It's very sad when I think times are changing, and more couples, when they get together, even monogamously, they have kind of the spaciousness, the emotional intelligence, the trust, to allow their partners to still keep their friends and its physical connection with them. I think that is happening more and more, especially in our culture, more spiritual circles and stuff, But it's still in the mainstream culture, that's not the case, So it's very, very tragic. It's called in the literature, it's called the phenomenon of dyadic withdrawal. That's how it's a term, where a couple come together and they withdraw themselves, they start cutting friendships. Of course, the guy is uncomfortable with the male friendships of her. She's uncomfortable with them. And then the other thing that happens too, that's even more crazy, is that they cannot make new friends of the opposite gender, especially if they're attractive, or they cannot spend time with them by themselves. It's like totally crazy. Of course, I'm talking in more mainstream. Many more people today are changing these chips, but still they're very prevalent.
Yeah, and it's not really the fault of one person that it is so crazy, but it is a culturally conditioned idea that it's a paradigm shift that really is tough it's tough to transcend those conventional paradigms.
It's structural, it's deeply internalized, like for centuries and centuries, but also there's like social pressure and coercion. For example, I have a friend who is together with a new partner. She's a female. The new partner has different female connections. She's like, okay. And then her female friends are like, what? Are you crazy? That's our chances that's going to end up cheating on you. You need to put limits on that. And it's the other way around. I think the more limits to put on people, the more rebelliousness, the more suffocated will feel, and they will need maybe to break out of that suffocation in a way that is impulsive and not constructive and painful and like cheating, in a bad way,
Yeah. So you experience that example is she's experiencing shame from her friendship circle, and just because she is loving freely the way that this relationship came into her life. And it is very fascinating to me that all of this is integrated. The participatory, it's like, so I guess a part of my question right now is, what kind of qualities does a person need to have to be able to communicate in this way with partners, with people? I have experienced you as very charismatic. Like you have a really great aura about you, and I believe that a lot of that is comes coming from this participatory deep dive inquiry, this deep dive inquiry into yourself and these questions of how you're relating to others, and people of all walks of life would benefit from doing those kind of deep dive inquiries. But what kind of qualities does a person need to have to be able to operate successfully in this way?
I'll go in there, but allow me a brief excursus that I think is also important. Like you said, you experienced me as charismatic, and I appreciate your mirroring. And I would say, like, very, very strongly, like, charisma is a human right. It's a human birthright. We all human beings have our own charisma. And I think charisma is like, especially when you understand charisma from a deeply psycho-spiritual perspective, I would say that it's like to really be in contact with, it connects with what you're saying, with your own inner resources, like life energy, vitality, that kind of energy. And then to use that energy not to power over, dominate, but to empower the charisma of others, to empower those resources in other people. And I think that that's what best teachers do in their classrooms, like their charisma or whatever experience is like at service of students, like stepping in there, But anyway, about your question, like qualities, I don't have any kind of 3 or 4 key, but what I would say, of course, in addition to the typical candidates like emotional intelligence, of course, like capability to listen, capability to separate the present from the past, crucial, right? A lot of the loops and challenges and difficulties of couples is because, someone said something that triggered something by resonance of the past of the other person that was painful, and the person projects that in the present situation. That capability to separate the present from the past, I think, is very, very important. And then I think also very important to really understand a relationship as a psycho-spiritual container, as a tool for psycho-spiritual growth of everybody involved. If you don't have that, it's going to be hard to not get loose in some of the loops. When you have that aspiration for both of you, then you are going to be much more receptive to criticism, to really look inside, to difficult mirroring, because you are there for growth, and also you're devoted to the growth of your partner, I think, like, from a psycho-spiritual perspective, a relationship is a structure that serves as a platform, for that individuation of each person, in addition to being an structure for the healing, sexual, emotional healing of both people, and also a structure to learn and receive embodied love in many different ways, So if you have like that understanding, that helps too a lot. And of course, there are many other skills that people learn in couple therapy. I see clients as well. They come to me, and sometimes I teach them schools about how to repair work, when someone was wounded, like betrayed, there's like some works you can do there, to help you. You probably are familiar with them.
To be a really great professional, I think that you have to have some sort of private practice where you are working, the workshops, the facilitation of spaces where people are learning and and all of that, but then also your own research interests. I think that that's really how it's the professional transpersonal psychologist. I think that's a professional transpersonalist. That's what that looks like.
Totally. I forgot something really important. Just very briefly, is the area of sexuality. In terms of because that's the Achilles heel of most monogamous relationships. Once they spend like a number of years together, sexuality is not what it used to be. And then passive aggression start kicking in, and then couple therapy, and then people start seeing more attractive other people, and finally one of them cheat unless they open the relationship. And this is the, everyday life for millions of couples today. That's the thing, So I think two key things here is like to really like for couples to really like, work with their sexuality in different ways, exploring, for example, transorgasmic sexuality. That can help a lot to minimize sexual habituation. That's one exploration. And of course, the other exploration is to open the relationship. And of course, here's like the jealousy piece. I would say that regardless your preferential relational style, monogamous or poly, to work on the jealousy is very important. And in the book, like I offer some exercises, based on the Buddhist contemplative tradition that they are effective, like to transform jealousy into compassion, into empathic love, and I think that's very important because even many monogamous people, Some of them, they are in a monogamous structure because they would not be able to tolerate their partner to be with others, even if they want to be with others. And then the people get stuck there. You see, there are so many things that working on jealousy would open up, and people have different conversations. And that's not to say that if you overcome jealousy, you are going to become or one polyamory, not at all. I think all options are equally valid, but you live also monogamy with greater spaciousness as well.
Yeah, so I like this. I think that your something that kind of ties all of this together a bit and into another question is that your reflection and your example as fully and freely expressed self gives other people permission to do the same. And that's sort of a little bit of where you went with the charisma, is that charisma it's an innate value in everyone. And my charisma does not take away from somebody else being charismatic. And my example of being freely expressed in my life does not take away from this other person. And in fact, the healthy way is that it invites this person to also rise in their way, to develop themselves to be fully expressed. And that's what we want. As transpersonalists, we are looking for the transformation in others. What is that transformation? It's the actualization of their potentialities. And what better way to do that? What better way to show somebody that they have the permission to than by being the example yourself? That's really great. Are there ways of being that are like these qualities, or ways of being that are more effective as the spiritual pragmatic? Are there ways for a female to be in a relationship that is different than a way that a man should be in a relationship? These concepts of the divine masculinity and the divine femininity, that we have both of those principles within ourselves, all of us, and these dynamics we are seeing them in the world all the time. There is the feminine of the mystery, and then there's the masculine of the execution of bringing out of the mystery this birthing of object and idea.
Yes, it's tricky. Like, no, I totally get where you're coming from, and it's tricky in terms like you probably are familiar with, like, if you study like different cultures cross-culturally, like the understandings of the feminine and masculine are sometimes opposites. You know, like Shiva and Shakti and Yin and Yang. You know, like in the Hindu tradition, Shiva is the active. You know, Shiva is kind of like the presence, immutable presence. In the Yin Yang is the other way around, right? The Yang is like the one that is making the movement, and the feminine is like just holding everything, you know. So, and of course, like today, like because also that whole transgender critique of gender, like we need to be super careful. That's why we say quotation marks when I use those terms, you know. Still, I think there is some validity to talk about those terms in our culture, in different conversations, you know. My sense, like, it's like, yeah, there is, I don't know, we call them masculine or feminine but there are like different two types of energy within ourselves, like more centripetal to war inside, more centrifugal, like materializing action, right? And there is like just inward, you know, like, and they manifest at all levels, like physically, resting action, sexually, like receiving, fully surrendering to sexual pleasure versus like going for it, like with action, like emotionally too, of course, expressing and receiving emotions, of course, like talking and listening, but also spiritually, like, you know, mindfulness, receptive practices versus like prayer, you know, or practices that like more, you know, so I see that. So yeah, for me, when people also like put, the gender to the different levels, I get a little, because I think I see all those forces going all the way through our humanness, and also all the way through, as you were pointing out, the divine mystery. And what's there, it's the androgynous, or it's like it's all together, and transcending is transgender, the new mystery. I mean, who knows, you know? But it's an exciting inquiry. We had in Barcelona like a whole panel of transpersonal psychology and non-binary identities, and we explored all that with a few other people. It was very exciting. There's a lot of there to inquire together.
Yeah, that's awesome. So further into this inquiry is like in a traditional relationship that is a man and a woman. I think most of the listeners or most people in the world, as we know, are in traditional monogamous relationships as the general dynamic that is around the world. So in those dynamics, is that masculinity, is there a part to play that masculinity plays that the feminine does not, and then vice versa? Are those important dynamics? When sometimes a female may be judged for being too masculine, like her
Right.
ambitions and her professional prowess and interests in being an entrepreneur and making money on her own is frowned upon,
Yes.
or it's put off by the masculine for like an inferiority complex of some sort. But is it important that those dynamics are balanced in a relationship? Can they
Yeah.
both be there in their fullest expression all the time?
Okay, I would say like yes, and the important is like to look at each relationship individually, case by case, right?
Yep.
Because any kind of generic statement around that is tricky because people are coming from different places. Some people are maybe finding this guy who's coming from a very alpha male, strong, and then he really is beneficial for him to embrace more feminine values, quotation marks, and or not. He's coming from a totally different place. Some couples maybe they achieve to dance between the gender and masculine and feminine within themselves, between themselves. I would say that sexually, that's a really good thing, actually. Sexually speaking, I can see a lot of value there because there is more diversity. You can allow yourself to be possessed, regardless of your gender, possessing someone, not in an emotional, controlling way, but in the instinctual codes of the instinct, that's very important there, like in the animal realm. So, and at the same time, for other couples, they may find an equilibrium in a different place. I come back again, whatever works, but at the same time, it's good that people don't get stuck. If people are growing, if people take a relationship as a platform of psychospiritual growth, that equilibrium will be changing, will be dynamic all their lives. And I think that's the path for most people, probably. Makes sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That life is an ongoing inquiry in yourself and in your relationships, and
Yeah.
you don't want it to be a lake with no waves. You don't want life to be this still glassy lake. You want it to
Right.
be the ocean. You want it to be this dramatic ups and
Absolutely.
downs and an adventure.
Yeah.
And I love how people might take different looks at your work and see them as very different things. They might see that initially on the surface as very different things, but it's all weaved together. I totally see how that's all
Exactly.
weaved together.
Yeah. I would say, like, if you allow me, like, I would say that one common denominator in the relationship work, love and freedom, and my transpersonal spiritual work is this stance of what I call critical pluralism. In which it's like an impulse towards like legitimizing the greater diversity of relational or spiritual options possible in their own terms, while at the same time keeping grounds for constructive criticisms, that is more contextualized and sometimes more generic, for example, I would be critical for any kind of violence in intimate relationships, that's, I think that's unacceptable. And I think that we should be very strongly critical of that. So and also no all people hold relationships the same way. For some people, monogamy or polyamory, they can live it in higher, lower frequencies with more or less integrity, with more or less mindfulness of social privilege, with more or less honesty, right? So it's not one is better than the other. It's depending on how you live it.
Right. Yeah. And it's so important for, I'm a man, and so I can speak for men in this way, but it's like it's so important for men to be clear in the ways that they are communicating in their relationships, having just human beings. I take the man out of that actually, because human beings need to be clear about just having some clarity. That comes from deep inquiry. It comes from deep inquiry into yourself and what you want and what you are able to see is potential exploration and potential growth potential, these are the ways that I get out of my stuckness in life, and so that I can continue to grow and have this great symphony of a life in the end.
Yes, I totally agree, and I would stress, like yes, deep inquiry, but just in case, like some people think, oh, they are thinking about deep inquiry, like going inward with meditation and plans, and that's part of it, psychotherapy. But deep inquiry into relationship by force needs to be lived relational inquiry. You inquire being in relationships with people, mindfully, and that doesn't mean that being an utilitarian of relationship for your own growth. I mean, there's a distortion of that. But to really go into the sense of adventure with this person and this open inquiry about who we are, how we love, where we're going. I mean, it's really beautiful and opening, versus like the relationship escalator, as it's called. Oh, now we're boyfriend, now we're engaged, now we're married and have kids, and then what? And that's fine. And for many people could be the path, and people want that. And I understand. I'm super respectful, and I'm a big admirer for parents. I didn't feel that call. And conscious parenting for me is one of the most amazing spiritual paths that are people are engaging and more challenging. But at the same time, that all these connections between the transpersonal and relational world, legitimizing the greater diversity of options, but at the same time, like let's be discerning. Let's be discerning. At the same time, also like different relationship styles would be good or better for different people. Like imagine, for example, like a woman who has been for most of her life controlled by a very jealous partner, and maybe even abuse, For this woman, encountering polyamory could be tremendously emancipatory. But maybe for another woman who was sexually abused by her father or incest, going into polyamory would be re-traumatizing to create too many things, and she might need the container of monogamy to heal. And so it really depends, That's why I'm always stressing this when my proposal is not about enthroning even novogamy, like being transgender is not better or worse than being male or female. It's just different.
If I say things like men should be this way, that's not every man, that's not every woman, that's not every identifier, that's not every person, that's not every human being. Different people have different strengths, different weaknesses, different areas of growth, different traumas, different experiences that will all come together in this beautiful song through like just exploration across your life in all of your relationships and yourself. What do you think is a last bit that you would want people to know about transforming themselves to be maybe more free in their life? What does somebody do if they are stuck? What do they do to embrace their love and freedom?
Yeah, it's a tricky question as well, because again, like depending on the person and where they are they with a partner in a monogamous container and the one exploring, is very tricky, because you need to be not only, this is important too, is also write about this in the book. It's also important not to enthrone freedom as the ultimate value, because people can like, freedom is the ultimate value. I start like acting recklessly and caringly and without compassion for other people, because freedom is like and then you need to accept freedom, like look for freedom, but with a greater ecological mindfulness of how the impact of your actions hit on other people. But that said, I would say to those people who are stuck, it's like, live your truth, live your truth, live those impulses with as much mindfulness and care as you're able, and if you are wrong or that's not your path, life is going to tell you. Life is going to tell you. Yes, if that's your path, and life is going to tell you too, and you're going to be opening grounds for you to live a much happier and fulfilling life. And also perhaps you are even opening grounds for the creative mystery to manifest through you in a very unique way. And it's going to be quite an interesting feast.
Right. Yeah. Live your truth. And you, there's so much stuckness in the attempt to live our truth, because we get so concerned about the eyes around us, the onlookers, and how we will be judged or shamed by our truth, whatever that might be. Sometimes you're shamed by the truth that you're living in your closest relationships, your parents, your family, your surrounding family, and your intimate partners. And and close friends
Yes.
and things like this. But living your truth, the world will tell you if the world will tell you if you're going in the right path or not.
But that's also what you say is very important. I know we need to close soon, but it's very important because that's why we need sometimes the sangha, you know, the group, the greenhouse, the workshop where we can experiment with those things in a very safe container. And in the greenhouse, we make it strong. So when we express it in the world, you know, it has already rooted, has had the support of a social group, you know, a small group supporting you. That's very important. Otherwise, you can hurt yourself, you know. As you mentioned, you can really it can backfire and become even more.
Right.
So yeah, and of course the professional support of transpersonal counselors such as yourself, you know, or people who really understand this process and can really support you step by step there, you know. So
conscious discernment is all a part of the process as well. And so you could harm yourself, you could harm others, and it is not fair to harm others or yourself in making freedom your highest value. Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you so much, Chris. I cherish the archiving of this conversation with you, Jorge. I really value you as a colleague, as another, you know, tribesman in this field of transpersonal psychology, this fellow explorer, fellow inquirer. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was been such a rare pleasure to have this conversation, like this dialogue that I really enjoy much more than talks or normal interviews, you know, as we're talking, like so much more fun. And yeah, maybe this conversation is of assistance to many people in your audience, you know, may help others, you know, how they say, like in the Buddhist tradition, like offer the merit of this conversation to others and all sentient beings and all that. It's always important. But thank you so much. You were great. I felt so at home here talking with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that this continues to help transpersonal scholars moving forward in any courses I teach. I'm gonna point them in this direction.
Wonderful.
Thank you so very much, Jorge. Once again, I appreciate it. What a wonderful conversation to have published on Valentine's Day. If you're doing any kind of deep relational inquiry, you have to check out his book, Love and Freedom, Transcending Monogamy and Polyamory. And if you are a transpersonal psychologist, you have to check out Participation and the Mystery. These are essays on transpersonal psychology, the participation theory, and critiques. He is an amazing scholar, as you have just seen. So comment, like, share, subscribe. Share this with your tribe. Share this with your community where you are safe to deeply inquire into the fullest expression of yourself. And happy Valentine's Day.
You're thinking, who is this man talking? I'm talking to you.